The engine of the moving truck rumbled to a stop, leaving an abrupt silence that settled over the neighborhood like a fog. Megan Harris stepped out of the car, the cool October air prickling her skin, and looked up at the house on 112 Ocean Avenue. It stood there, looming, a towering relic of colonial architecture with its distinctive gambrel roof and those strange half-moon windows staring down like eyes. For a moment, she felt a chill, a creeping unease she couldn't quite shake. It almost felt as if the house was watching her, waiting. Daniel hopped out of the driver's seat, clapping his hands together and grinning. "Well, here we are, home sweet home," he said, trying to sound enthusiastic, though Megan could see the slight twitch in his jaw, the uncertainty that flickered across his face. He was always the optimist, the one who could take a disaster and spin it into something hopeful. She admired that about him, even if she didn't quite believe it herself right now. Megan looked back at the kids. Emily and Noah, who were still strapped into the back seat. Emily had her nose pressed against the window, staring at the house with wide eyes. Noah, on the other hand, was curled up in his car seat, clutching his stuffed bear. Mr. Snuggles, as if the world outside was too much to bear. "It's big," Emily said, her voice muffled by the glass. "Bigger than our old house." "Yes, it is," Megan replied, forcing a smile. "Lots of room for you and Noah to run around." Emily didn't respond, still staring out the window, her expression unreadable. Megan's smile faltered. It had been like this ever since they'd moved, the strange quietness, the way the kids seemed to shrink into themselves. Maybe it was just the stress of the move, she thought. Maybe it was just everything. They had left behind a life that felt broken, stained by a year of grief and confusion. Megan had struggled to keep herself together after her father's disappearance, and the strain had nearly torn her family apart. This move was supposed to be a new beginning, a chance to escape the past. But now, standing in front of the house, Megan couldn't help but feel that they had stepped into something much darker. "All right, troops," Daniel said, turning to the kids. "Let's go explore our new castle." Emily was the first to scramble out, running ahead to the front steps. Megan followed, feeling the weight of her unease deepen as she approached the front door. The realtor's description had been glowing, and the price was shockingly low for a house this size, especially considering the area. But there had been something off about it too, a hesitation. When Megan had asked why it had been on the market for so long. "Just a little bad history," the realtor had said with a laugh, waving it off. "You know how these things are." Bad history. The phrase echoed in Megan's mind as she stepped over the threshold. The air inside was thick, almost suffocating, carrying the faint scent of something she couldn't quite place, like old wood and damp earth. It wasn't unpleasant, but it felt wrong, as if the house had been sealed off for a long time and was only now starting to breathe again. The living room was spacious, with high ceilings and dark, polished wood floors. There was a fireplace against the far wall, framed by built-in bookshelves that still held a few dusty volumes left behind by the previous owners. Megan traced her fingers over the spines, feeling a shiver as she noticed some of the titles. Occult Practices, The Ritual of the Sixth Gate, Studies in Demonology. She pulled her hand back quickly, as if she had been burned. "Cool place, huh?" Daniel said, coming up behind her. I mean, yeah, it's a little creepy, but it's got character. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. You okay? Megan nodded, even though she wasn't sure she was. Yeah, just taking it all in. Mommy, look, Emily's voice rang out from the hallway. Megan turned to see her daughter standing by the stairs, pointing up at the darkened landing. There's a door up there that's locked. Can I see what's inside? I'm sure it's just the attic, honey. We'll check it out later, Megan said, her voice a little too tight, a little too forced. She could feel her heartbeat quickening, a low thrum of anxiety that seemed to resonate with the house itself. As they unpacked, Emily kept darting back to that locked door, as if drawn to it by some invisible force. Megan tried to distract her, but it was no use. It wasn't until later, when they were all sitting down to dinner, that Emily finally spoke up again. I saw someone up there, she said casually, as if she were talking about seeing a bird in the yard. A man. He was smiling at me. The room went silent. Megan's fork froze halfway to her mouth, and she exchanged a glance with Daniel, who was trying to mask his concern. Honey, there's no one else here, he said carefully. Maybe you just saw a shadow. Emily shook her head. He was real. He had a white face and he was smiling like this. She stretched her lips into a wide, unnatural grin, her eyes dark and unblinking. Megan felt a cold sweat prickling at the back of her neck. Emily, stop it. That's not funny. I'm not trying to be funny, Emily said, her voice flat. He said his name is Mr. Smiles, and he lives here too. Megan's stomach twisted, a sickening knot of fear tightening inside her. All right, that's enough, she said, trying to sound firm. There's no Mr. Smiles, okay? It's just your imagination. But even as she said the words, she could feel the lie in them. The house seemed to pulse around her, as if amused by her denial. She knew then, deep down, that something was very, very wrong. That night, after the kids were asleep, Megan wandered the house, checking the locks, peeking through the windows, searching for something she couldn't quite name. She found herself drawn to the attic stairs, the old wood creaking under her weight as she climbed. The old locked door was still there, looming at the end of the darkened hall. She hesitated, reaching out to touch the doorknob, and as her fingers brushed against it, she heard it. A whisper. Low and almost imperceptible, as if someone was standing just on the other side. She jerked her hand back, heart hammering in her chest, and backed away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She ran downstairs, hoping to find solace in the familiar warmth of the living room. But as she turned the corner, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, on the mantel above the fireplace, was a small porcelain doll. Its face painted a bright, garish white, its lips curled into a grin that was too wide, too unnatural. She hadn't seen it there before. She was sure of it. The doll's eyes were wide open, staring straight at her, unblinking. Megan backed away slowly, her mind racing, trying to rationalize it. But deep down, she could feel the house watching her, just as she had felt when she arrived, waiting for her to understand. It wasn't until she turned out the lights and crawled into bed beside Daniel that she realized she was still holding the key she had found in the kitchen drawer earlier that evening, an old, tarnished thing that looked like it hadn't been used in years. She clutched it tightly as if it were a talisman, and as she drifted off to sleep, she heard a faint, echoing voice. We're just getting started." And then the house exhaled. Megan's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages of the journal she had found in the attic. The words were scrawled in a hurried, frantic script, as if the writer had been racing against time or against something much darker. It was her father's handwriting. She recognized the loops and jagged edges of his letters, the way he pressed hard into the page, leaving grooves. She could barely breathe as she read the first line. "It whispers to me in the dark. I think it knows my name." Megan sat on the attic floor, her back pressed against the cold, wooden wall as she continued to read. The entries were dated from a year ago, just before he disappeared. Her father, Henry, had never mentioned visiting Amityville, yet here was proof that he had not only been in the house but had stayed here long enough to write pages upon pages about his experiences. Each entry became more erratic, the once coherent thoughts dissolving into ramblings about voices, shadows, and something lurking beneath the surface. "I've seen it, but I can't describe it. It's like a stain that spreads, a darkness that consumes everything. And it knows everything about me, even the things I've hidden from myself." Megan's pulse quickened as she read on. There were sketches. Alongside the entries, crude drawings of twisted, human-like figures with hollow eyes and wide, grinning mouths, each one more disturbing than the last. The more she looked, the more she realized the figures resembled Mr. Smiles, the imaginary friend Emily had described. She quickly closed the journal, feeling as though she was being watched, and glanced around the attic. The shadows seemed deeper here, as if the room had swallowed up all the light from the small, dusty window. Downstairs, she could hear Daniel moving around, trying to keep the kids occupied. She needed to talk to him, to show him what she had found, but a part of her hesitated. How could she explain this without sounding crazy? Even now, she wasn't sure she could trust her own eyes. But before she could gather her thoughts, she noticed a scrap of paper poking out from between the pages. It was another note, this one in her father's frantic, looping handwriting. "It's coming from the basement. That's where it wants me to go. I don't know if I'll make it back out." Megan tried to keep herself calm as she descended the narrow staircase to the basement. She had never liked basements. They were always too dark, too still, as if time itself forgot to move down there. But there was something especially oppressive about this one, as though the walls were closing in, suffocating her. The air was cold, and with each step she took, it felt like it was growing colder still. She found the trapdoor hidden behind a stack of old boxes, just as her father had described. It was small, barely noticeable, and would have been easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. The hinges creaked as she pried it open, revealing a narrow set of stone steps leading down into the dark. A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to continue, gripping the flashlight tightly in her hand. The smell hit her first, a damp, earthy scent mixed with something metallic, like rust or blood. She descended slowly, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the dark, revealing strange symbols carved into the stone walls. They were jagged, angular, and almost painful to look at, twisting and looping in ways that defied logic. The steps opened into a small, cavernous room, its walls covered in more of the symbols. There were candles, some burnt down to stubs, others still standing tall, arranged in a rough circle around the center of the room. And there, at the heart of it all, was an altar, stained dark with something she didn't want to think about. Her father's words echoed in her mind. The house feeds off guilt and fear. It knows your secrets. As she approached the altar, she saw something glinting in the dim light. A photograph, pinned beneath a shard of broken glass. She picked it up, her hands shaking, and felt the breath leave her lungs. It was a picture of her father, staring straight into the camera, his face twisted in an expression of pure terror. Written across the bottom in a horrid, jagged scrawl were the words, "I tried to warn you." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Megan barely remembered climbing back up from the basement, barely registered Daniel's concerned voice when he saw her pale, trembling form. She shoved the journal and photograph into his hands, forcing him to read, to see, to understand. He looked through it, his brow furrowing, his lips tightening. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, almost condescending. This doesn't mean anything, Meg," he said, trying to reason with her. "Maybe your dad had some kind of breakdown. He was clearly going through something. But it's over. He's gone." "No, you don't understand," she snapped, her voice cracking. "He was here, Daniel, right here. He knew about the house and whatever was happening to him. It's happening to us, too." "Megan," Daniel started, but she didn't let him finish. "Emily has been talking to that thing, Mr. Smiles, just like the drawings in the journal. She said he knows things about us, things she shouldn't know." Daniel's face softened, his eyes filled with concern. "She's just a kid, Meg. Kids make up stories. You're letting your imagination run wild." But Megan could see the cracks in his resolve, the doubt creeping into his eyes. She handed him the photograph. "Look at this. Does that look like a man who was imagining things?" Daniel stared at the photograph, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge. He didn't speak, but she could see the way his eyes darted nervously around the room, as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. That night, Megan's sleep was restless, plagued by nightmares of her father, his eyes wide and empty, his mouth moving soundlessly as he tried to tell her something she couldn't understand. She woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of whispers echoing in her ears. The room felt heavy, suffocating, and for a moment she thought she could see a figure standing at the foot of her bed. But when she blinked, it was gone. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak and settle around her. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of laughter, high and echoing like a child's giggle. She told herself it was just her imagination, that she was still half dreaming. But the laughter didn't stop. It seemed to get louder, closer, until she could almost feel the warm breath on her cheek. Then she heard it, clear as day, a voice, soft and sing-song, whispering right into her ear. "You can't hide from me." Megan bolted upright, her heart pounding. She glanced around the room, her eyes darting to every shadow, but there was nothing there, only the darkness, stretching out and swallowing everything. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that something was waiting just out of sight, smiling at her. She stumbled out of bed and crept to Emily's room, needing to make sure her daughter was okay. She found Emily sitting upright in bed, her eyes wide open, staring straight ahead. "Emily," Megan whispered, but the girl didn't respond. She just kept staring, her lips slightly parted, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Megan felt her stomach twist, a sickening knot of fear tightening inside her. "Emily, sweetheart, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice shaking. Emily slowly turned her head, her eyes locking onto Megan's, and smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched her lips too far. "He says you've been reading his books," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He doesn't like that." Megan's blood ran cold. "Who?" she managed to choke out, though she already knew the answer. Emily's grin widened and her eyes darkened as if something else were looking out from behind them. "Mr. Smiles," she said, her voice echoing strangely, as if layered over with another, deeper voice. "He's coming to see you, Mommy. He says he's very excited." And then, as Megan watched, Emily's expression went blank, her eyes rolling back into her head, and she slumped back onto the pillow, as if nothing had happened. Megan stood there, frozen, the darkness closing in around her. And in the silence she heard it again, that faint, terrible giggle echoing through the house like a taunt. She knew then that whatever had happened to her father was happening to her, and the house wasn't just haunted, it was hungry. The house was changing. Megan could feel it. The once familiar creaks and groans had taken on a sinister rhythm, a language of whispers and sighs that seemed to speak directly to her, mocking her fear, feeding off it. Every room felt wrong, distorted, as if the walls were closing in, bending at unnatural angles. The air was suffocating, thick with a metallic taste that clung to her tongue, making it hard to breathe. It had been days since Megan found her father's journal, and everything had unraveled since. Daniel's cheerful optimism had evaporated, replaced by a dark, brooding silence that frightened her more than his skepticism ever had. He was barely sleeping, his eyes bloodshot and hollow, and when he did speak, it was often in sharp, clipped phrases, like he was holding back something ugly, something violent. Megan knew the house was working on him, twisting him, but she felt powerless to stop it. It was late one night, after another nightmare-filled attempt at sleep, that Megan awoke to find the bed beside her, empty. She reached out, feeling the cold sheets where Daniel should have been, and felt a stab of dread. She listened carefully, straining to catch any sound, and then she heard it. The faint murmur of voices coming from downstairs. She crept out of bed and tiptoed down the hallway, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. As she descended the stairs, the voices grew louder, and she recognized Daniel's voice, low and hushed, as if he were having a secret conversation. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she could see him in the living room, standing with his back to her, his head tilted slightly to the side, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. "Daniel," she called softly, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. She took a cautious step forward, and that's when she noticed it. The wall behind him, where the wallpaper had started to peel away, exposing a dark, pulsating mass that seemed to writhe and twitch under the surface. It was like a black vein spreading out across the wall, and she could see tiny cracks forming around it, as if the house was trying to contain something that wanted desperately to get out. "Daniel," she repeated louder this time, and he finally turned to look at her. His eyes were glazed, unfocused, as if he were seeing something far away. For a moment he didn't seem to recognize her, and then a slow, strange smile crept across his lips. "Meg," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just talking. They have so much to say, you know." Megan felt her blood turn to ice. "Who are you talking to?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Daniel's smile widened, stretching his lips in a way that made her stomach churn. "The house," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "It's been trying to explain things to me, to help me see." "See what?" Megan asked, her heart pounding. Daniel's eyes darkened, and he took a step closer to her, his gaze locked on hers. "That you're hiding something, that you're not being honest with us, with yourself." Megan took a step back, panic rising in her chest. "Daniel, this isn't you. The house it's manipulating you, making you say things. We have to leave now." But Daniel just shook his head, his smile never faltering. "No, Meg. We're here because we're meant to be here. It's time you understood that." Megan spent the next few days in a haze of fear and paranoia. She tried to convince Daniel to leave, but he refused, becoming more withdrawn, more hostile. She barely recognized him anymore. Meanwhile, Emily's behavior grew even more disturbing. She would sit for hours in the corner of her room, staring at the wall, whispering to herself, her lips moving in a rapid, almost frantic pattern. When Megan tried to talk to her, Emily would turn to her with those dark, vacant eyes, and smile that same unnerving smile she had when she talked about Mr. Smiles. "Mommy, he told me a secret," Emily said one morning as she sat at the breakfast table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "He said you're afraid because you did something bad. Is that true?" Megan's throat tightened. "Emily, that's enough. I don't want you talking to him anymore." "But he knows things," Emily insisted, her voice oddly calm. "He said you're going to try to run away, but it won't work. He said you can't hide from what's inside you." Megan felt a sharp, sudden pain in her chest, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. She pushed her chair back abruptly and stumbled away from the table, her hands shaking. She couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the nightmares, the feeling that she was being watched every moment of the day. She had to find out what the house wanted, what it was trying to do to her family, even if it meant confronting the very thing she was most afraid of. It was dark by the time she made her way back down to the basement. She had spent hours poring over her father's journal, looking for anything that might help her understand, and she kept coming back to that one line. "It's coming from the basement. That's where it wants me to go." The trap door was already open, as if the house had been waiting for her. She descended the stairs, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The room at the bottom was different this time. The symbols had spread, covering every inch of the stone, and there were new markings, fresh and wet, as if someone had carved them recently. In the center of the room, directly above the altar, was a mirror. She hadn't noticed before. It was old and cracked, the glass fogged over with grime, but she could still make out her own reflection, distorted and shadowed. As she approached, she realized that the mirror wasn't reflecting the room behind her. Instead, it showed another room entirely. A dark, narrow space filled with old, rotting furniture and piles of decaying books. Megan's breath hitched as she stared into the mirror, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. And then, slowly, the reflection shifted. She saw herself, but it wasn't her. It was a twisted, hollow version of herself, her skin pale and translucent, her eyes dark and sunken, with a smile that stretched unnaturally wide across her face. "Do you see it now?" a voice whispered, low and mocking. Do you see what's been hiding inside you all this time?" Megan stumbled back, her flashlight flickering, but the reflection didn't disappear. It continued to smile at her, its eyes glinting with a cruel, knowing light. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The reflection's smile widened, and for a moment she thought she could see something moving beneath its skin, writhing and twisting as if trying to break free. "I want you to remember," it said. "I want you to see what you've buried, what you've forgotten. You're not here by accident, Megan. You're here because you belong to me." Megan felt a wave of nausea wash over her, memories flashing through her mind in rapid, disjointed images. Her father's face twisted in pain, Emily's eerie smile, Daniel standing in the dark, talking to something that wasn't there. And then she saw herself standing over the same altar, her hands covered in blood, chanting words she didn't understand. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not real. It can't be real." The reflection laughed, a low, guttural sound that seemed to echo through the room. "You can't hide from the truth, Megan. You tried to bury it, but it's still there, festering, waiting to be let out. And now you've come back, just like I knew you would." Megan felt her knees buckle, and she collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The room around her seemed to twist and warp, the walls closing in, the darkness pressing down on her like a weight. She could feel something crawling beneath her skin, a horrible itching sensation that spread up her arms into her chest like she was being taken over from the inside out. And then she heard it. Daniel's voice, coming from somewhere behind her. "Meg, what are you doing down here?" She turned, and there he was, standing at the top of the stairs, his face half hidden in shadow. But there was something wrong, something in the way he was standing, the way his head tilted just slightly to the side, like he was listening to something she couldn't hear. "I found you," he said, his voice soft and detached. "I found you, and now we can finish what we started." Megan's heart stopped. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't move. She could only watch as Daniel descended the stairs, slowly, methodically, his eyes locked on hers, and behind him, she could see the shadows shifting, twisting, taking on familiar shapes. The figures from her father's sketches, their hollow eyes staring, their mouths stretching into wide, terrible grins. As Daniel reached the bottom of the stairs, he reached out and took her hand, his fingers cold and clammy, and leaned in close, whispering into her ear. "It's already inside you," he said, his breath warm against her skin. "You've been trying to run from it, but you can't escape what you are." And as Megan looked into his eyes, she saw her own reflection staring back at her, that same twisted, hollow version of herself, smiling, waiting, ready to consume her. Megan stood in the dark cavern, her entire body trembling, her breath ragged and uneven. The room pulsed around her, the walls slick with moisture, oozing like a living, breathing thing. She could feel the house's heartbeat, slow and deliberate, echoing through the floor beneath her feet. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to get out, but she knew she was beyond that now. There was no escape. There was only the truth, waiting for her to confront it. The altar loomed before her, its surface stained and scarred, the symbols carved into it twisting and writhing as if alive. Candles flickered around it, casting a sickly yellow light that made the shadows dance. In the center, nestled like a dark seed, was the heart of the house, a pulsating fleshy mass, its surface slick and glistening, beating with a slow, rhythmic throb. Daniel stood beside it, his face pale, his eyes empty and distant. He no longer resembled the man she had married. He was a husk, hollowed out and filled with something dark, something ancient. His lips moved silently, whispering words she couldn't understand, his hands trembling as he held a rusted knife above the heart. "Daniel, stop!" Megan choked out, but her voice was weak, barely audible over the rhythmic thump of the heart. "Please, you don't have to do this." Daniel's eyes flickered, a faint spark of recognition, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He smiled, a slow, languid smile, and turned to look at her, his gaze soft and pitying. "But I do, Meg. It's the only way. The house needs to feed, and it's chosen us to be its vessel." Megan shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Number, this isn't you. It's manipulating you, twisting your mind. You have to fight it." Daniel's expression darkened and he stepped closer, the knife gleaming in his hand. "Fight it," he repeated, his voice low and mocking. "Why would I fight it? I see it now, Meg. I see what you've been hiding, what you've been running from all this time." Megan backed away, her heart pounding, the truth clawing at her throat. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, even though she did. She had always known, deep down, but she had buried it, hidden it away, hoping it would never come to light. But the house had seen through her, stripping away every lie, every pretense, until only the raw, ugly truth remained. "You lied to us," Daniel said, his voice soft and gentle, almost like a caress. "You lied about your father. You lied about why we came here. You knew what this place was, and you brought us here anyway." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath out of her lungs. "No," she gasped, shaking her head violently. I didn't know." "Yes, you did," Daniel said, his eyes narrowing. "You knew because you've been here before. You were here when he disappeared, weren't you? You were with him when the house took him." The ground seemed to drop out from under her, and suddenly she was falling, spiraling down into the dark, into memories she had tried so desperately to forget. She could see it now, clearer than ever. The night her father had brought her to the house. His face pale and drawn, his eyes wild with fear. He had been searching for something, and she had followed him, a curious child, not understanding the danger. She remembered the basement wall, the ritual room, the way her father's hands had trembled as he traced the symbols on the floor. "I'm sorry, Megan," he had whispered, his voice cracking. "I never should have brought you here. I thought I could stop it, but it's too strong. It's inside me." She hadn't understood then, but she understood now. The house had taken him, just as it was trying to take her, to consume her whole. She had run from that night, run from the truth, but she had never escaped it, and now it had brought her back, lured her into its grasp, because it knew she couldn't resist the pull. Megan's knees buckled and she sank to the floor, her vision blurring with tears. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please, let them go. Take me, but let them go." The house seemed to shudder, the air around her thickening, pressing down on her like a vice. She could hear it laughing, a low, rumbling sound that reverberated through the walls, through her bones. "Oh, Megan," it whispered, its voice slithering into her mind, dark and seductive. "It's not that simple. You can't sacrifice yourself to save them, because you're the one who brought them here. You're the one who opened the door." Daniel's hand trembled, the knife wavering as if he was struggling to hold on to his own will. "Megan," he said, his voice cracking, "make it stop. Please, make it stop." Megan looked up at him, her heart breaking. She could see him fighting, trying to resist, but she knew he was losing. The house was too strong, too insidious. It had wormed its way inside him, twisting his mind just as it had twisted hers. She realized then that there was only one way to end it, one way to break the cycle. She reached out and took his hand, guiding the knife down, pressing the tip against her own chest. "No," she said, her voice steady, even as tears streamed down her face. "It ends with me." Daniel's eyes widened, the fog clearing for a moment, and he shook his head. "No, I can't. I won't." "You have to," Megan whispered. "If you love me, you'll do it. You'll set us free." For a moment, there was only silence, the two of them locked in a desperate, unspoken battle. And then, slowly, Daniel's grip tightened around the knife, his hand trembling as he pressed it against her skin. "I love you," he whispered, his voice choked with anguish. "I'm so sorry." Megan closed her eyes, bracing herself for the pain, but before the blade could pierce her skin, she felt a sudden, violent jolt, as if the house had been struck by a massive, unseen force. The walls shuddered, the symbols flickering, and she heard a sound like glass shattering, echoing through the cavern. When she opened her eyes, the heart was writhing, its surface splitting open. Dark, viscous blood, spilling out and pooling on the floor. The house was screaming, a high, keening wail that pierced through her skull, and she realized with a jolt of horror that it was afraid. "No," the house hissed, its voice desperate, frantic. "You don't understand. You can't do this. You belong to me." Megan felt a surge of defiance, a fire igniting in her chest. She grabbed the knife from Daniel's hand and turned to the heart, raising the blade high above her head. "No," she said, her voice strong and clear. "I don't belong to you. You're nothing but a parasite, feeding on our fear, our pain, but you don't control me anymore." With a scream, she plunged the knife into the heart, driving it deep, and the house shuddered, its walls cracking, splintering. The air was filled with the sound of 1,000 voices, wailing, howling, but she didn't stop. She twisted the blade, tearing through the flesh, and the heart exploded. A shower of dark, rotting blood sprang across the room. The light flickered, dimmed, and then everything went silent. When Megan opened her eyes, she was lying on the floor, the knife still clutched in her hand. The room was dark, the symbols gone, the altar reduced to a crumbling heap of stone. She could hear the faint sound of wind, the soft creak of the house settling, and for a moment she thought it was over. But then she felt it, a faint, familiar pulse. Still beating, still there, deep beneath the floor. She struggled to her feet, her entire body aching, and looked around. Daniel was slumped against the wall, unconscious but breathing, his face pale but peaceful. She stumbled over to him, her hands shaking, and gently shook him awake. "Daniel," she whispered. "Daniel, please." He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, and when he looked at her, she saw the man she loved, not the empty, hollow shell the house had tried to make him. "Megan," he said, his voice raw. "Is it over?" Megan hesitated, glancing back at the shattered remnants of the heart. She wanted to say yes, to tell him it was finished, But she knew better. The house was wounded, weakened, but it wasn't dead. Not yet. It was still there, still waiting, still hungry. "We need to go," she said, helping him to his feet. "We need to go.